Let's get more now with Ben Aris, who's in Berlin. He's the editor-in-chief at BNE IntelliNews. Really good to have you back with us, Ben. Can I start by asking you about Trump's latest comments? Because it does seem like the rift between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelenskyy is growing by the day. Trump calling him a dictator and calling for fresh elections in Ukraine. What is Trump's purpose here, apart from simply disparaging the Ukrainian leader?
It's extraordinary, isn't it? It's going incredibly fast. Only last week, Zelenskyy was talking about doing a minerals deal worth like hundreds of billions of dollars, and Trump was indicating that, yes, he was very interested in that. However, the deal that was actually presented to Ukraine was just incredibly bad. Basically, the Americans came and said, we want to take control of all of Ukraine's natural resources, considerable natural resources, including rare earth metals. And Zelenskyy rejected that deal because it was just signing away the family jewels and getting very little. And so much as Zelenskyy was insisting, like, yes, we'll do this mineral deal, but I have to have a security guarantee. This is what he's striving for. All his talks, NATO membership or bilateral deals with the Europeans, and that was not offered. So he rejected the deal. And since then, the relations have deteriorated rapidly. Trump is very angry, I think, that Zelenskyy hasn't accepted his deal. And then he made some disparaging remarks about Zelenskyy not being a legitimate president. Zelenskyy's period in office expired last May, but under the Ukrainian constitution, you cannot hold elections during while there's a military martial law in effect, which there is, and so it's quite legitimate that he stayed on. And then they've got into this slagging match, shouting at each other. And I think Zelenskyy must be extraordinarily frustrated because, poignantly, not only was Europe excluded from the peace talks that just started in Riyadh 2 days ago, but Ukraine hasn't turned up either. And now that's being negotiated behind their back. And there's clearly an economic dynamic going on here. That Rubio's comments suggested that there's energy involved. And specifically, Lavrov, the foreign minister, also has been mentioning the Arctic, where Russia has massive reserves of oil and gas. And interestingly, from the five-man team it was in Riyadh on the Russian side, one of the representatives, Proskor Yakov, is an expert on the Arctic, and he's not a high-profile diplomat, so he was there to talk business. And Rubio said that there's an historic opportunity of unlocking relations. So it's starting to appear that, the Trump team are looking to do some sort of joint oil and gas projects with Russia, because Russia remains the source of a lot of untapped oil and gas in the world, and Trump's drill baby drill has made it clear that he sees oil and gas as a key part of his administration. And in the light of all of this, Zelenskyy is trying to get a post-war deal that ensures his security so that this war doesn't happen again. And his interests are just not being taken into account. Hence, I think he's got to the point where he's actually starting to complain out loud and said at a press conference, Trump is existing in a pro-Russian information bubble. And you don't do that with Trump. He's not got a thick skin. If you say rude things about him, he resents it, holds it against you. And you could say now that the whole Ukraine-Russia relationship is collapsing rapidly, and that Trump's just going to do some sort of economic deal with Russia, bring it back into the fold, drop the sanctions. All of this. Basically, this is the worst case scenario that we were expecting with Trump coming in, that he would just crash around like a bull in the china shop, doing deals that are American first interest, and ignore everything else, ignore Ukraine, throw it under the bus, cut off weapon supplies, cut off money supplies, because he's simply not interested in this conflict and wants to get out of it as fast as he can.
On top of that, Ben, fighting is continuing on the ground, and Russia says its forces are advancing on all fronts against Ukraine. Russian forces say they've recaptured 800 square kilometers of its Kursk region from Ukrainian forces, and that represents about 64% of the total area taken by Ukraine since an incursion began last year. And we know in 2022, Russia unilaterally declared its annexation of areas in and around 4 Ukrainian oblasts. They are Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk and Zaporizhia. That's on top of Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014. Volodymyr Zelensky's initial goal was to retake all of its territory, including Crimea, but that really does seem like a fantasy now, doesn't it, given how Donald Trump is approaching the matter. Compromise on Ukraine's front seems inevitable at this point, doesn't it?
Indeed, and this is another item that came out of the Riyadh talks, is that the American team have said basically that Ukraine has to be ready to give away all its territory. I mean, the Russians occupy about 20%. And at the end of last year, the Kremlin, in the sort of leaked comments, suggested that there was a little bit of wiggle room, and that the Kremlin suggested, rather than, because they were insisting that the Ukrainians hand over the 4 annexed regions, but the Russian forces don't actually occupy all of those regions. And the Kremlin suggested that perhaps we could freeze it along the front line, in other words, not get all of those regions under Russian control. But then Lavrov in the talks hardened his position just 2 days ago and said, look, there's going to be no land swaps at all, and that we're going to keep everything we've got. And as you say, the battlefield is not going well. The Russian forces are now within just a few kilometers of Pokrovsk, which is a key town in the Donbass, which is a major node for roads and railway, and basically a logistics hub that's supplying the whole defense in the Eastern Front in Donbass. And if that falls, which looks increasingly likely, then it could be that the whole Ukrainian defense in Donbass collapses, because it's going to be extremely hard to supply them.
Ben, Aris, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks, as always, for joining us on the program.